if you haven't been with us for the past several weeks, we've been in this series where we've been walking through the book of Galatians. And in fact, if you've got your Bibles, why don't we go ahead and turn there? We're going to be in Galatians chapter 4 this week. Galatians 4. If you don't have your Bibles, we should have Bibles in the chairs in front of you. And I believe we're on page 974. And while you guys are turning there, I do have to do a little bit of review to catch everybody up. Because as we've been walking through the book of Galatians, what we see is that Paul is writing this letter to the churches of Galatia. And the reason he's writing this letter is because there's this group of people that today we know as the Judaizers who have come in and they've begun to change the message of Jesus, what Paul is going to refer to as the gospel message. Now again, this word gospel literally means good news. And for Paul, whenever he says this, the good news is that we are saved by the grace of God through faith and through faith alone in Jesus. And for Paul, this is key because I think for a lot of us, our temptation is to try to earn our salvation. That a lot of us, it's easy for us to get this mentality that if I just do enough good works, if my good works, how many of us have ever thought this? If my good works just kind of barely outweigh my bad works, then God has to let me into heaven. It's almost like high school. For some of you, you are here today and you were rock stars in high school. For you, you didn't even have to try. You just got A's and B's and you're like, yeah, this is no problem. Of course, you were also the people who said, oh, I totally failed that test and you got an A every time. And then there was the rest of us. And we weren't that lucky. That we would study hours and hours and hours. Some of that was through osmosis. Don't you judge me. But we would study for hours and barely get by with C's and D's. And our mentality was what? If I just get a good enough grade, then they have to let me pass. They have to let me graduate. There's nothing that they can do. Their hands are tied. They have to let me graduate. I think sometimes we want to take that same mentality and apply it to our faith. That if my good works just kind of barely outweigh my bad, then God has to let me into heaven. And the problem with this is that if we're honest, we don't really know where we stand, do we? We don't really know how many good works we've done. And the problem with that is that our good works throughout our whole life, that's a lot to keep up with. I don't even remember what I had for lunch yesterday, let alone how many good works I've done. The other problem with that is that a lot of times when it comes to the sin in our life, a lot of times we don't even realize that we've done anything wrong until like years down the road, right? And as we look back in hindsight, we're like, oh, that was a terrible mistake. I regret making that. See, the problem with the scales is that you never really know where you stand with God. And what Paul is saying here is the good news of Jesus is you don't have to worry about that because we are saved by the grace of God through faith and through faith alone in Jesus. And the problem here is that these Judaizers have come in and they've begun to tell the Galatians, you know, that whole faith thing, that's like square one. That's the first step when it comes to being saved. But if you really want to be saved, there's all of this other junk, all of this other stuff that you have to do. And the stuff that they're talking about has to do with the rites and the rituals and the traditions in Judaism. And so if you missed us last week in Galatians 3, Paul talked about that. Paul talked about how the rites and the rituals or the law, the Torah, it was never meant to save us from our sin. That it was never meant to save us from our sin. And to help us, Paul reminded us of this story in Genesis 15 where Abraham steps into this covenant relationship with God. And he notices that Abraham, I almost said Paul, Abraham steps into that relationship not by doing a bunch of good stuff. Not by keeping the law, which, by the way, came 430 years afterwards. He steps into that covenant relationship by faith and faith alone in God. Genesis 15:6, Abraham believed and he counted it as righteousness. That he steps into that covenant through faith, and the same thing is true with us through Jesus. Which, of course, then raised the question, and this is where we wrapped up last week. What is the point of the law? Why do we have all the rules and the regulations in the scriptures? And what Paul said was that the reason we have the law was because of sin. Sin in my life, sin in your life. We live in a world of brokenness. If you don't believe me, go watch the news. It's just the first thing that you see every single day, isn't it? That we live in a world of brokenness. And so Paul says the law was our guardian. And when you hear the word guardian here, I want you to think of a legal guardian over a child, right? A court-appointed guardian, something like that, right? That's what he's talking about here. And the responsibility, one of the responsibilities of a guardian was to teach right and wrong. You see, the Torah, God's law, was never meant to save us. The law was meant to teach us how we begin to live out our faith, how we begin to follow God in a broken world of sin, because it gets confusing, doesn't it? A lot of times this is why we sin, because we're convinced that this wrong thing is actually right. God's law was meant to show us what it looks like to live out God's law, or in the words of Jesus, how to have healthy relationships with God and with each other. And so with that in mind, we're going to begin in Galatians 4. And actually, I wanted to begin in Galatians 3, verse 29. It's the last verse in Galatians 3. And the reason I wanted to start there is, remember, this is a long letter. That there weren't originally chapters and verses and those sort of things when he wrote it, that it was just one long, continuous point that he was making. And so what he says in 3 has this carryover in Galatians 4. And so we're going to begin in Galatians 3, verse 29. He says this, "And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise." That when we put our faith in Jesus, by the way, if you read Genesis 15 carefully enough, what you begin to see is that Jesus and his death on the cross actually fulfills the covenant that was made in Genesis 15. This is one of the points that Paul is trying to connect with us. And so when we put our faith in Jesus, he says that we are heirs to the promise. Now, in the ancient world, whenever you hear the word heir, H-E-I-R, an heir, I want you to also think about the inheritance that goes along with it, because this is going to be key for Paul as he goes forward, and this is going to be a little bit confusing, so we're going to walk through it and explain it together. Here we go. Galatians 4:1, Paul says this, "I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he's the owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by his father." Now, in the Greek and in the Jewish world, a child, an heir, a child, was considered a child up until a certain point. This was usually a date that was set by the father. Oftentimes, this was around 13 years old. But up until that point, they were considered a child. But after that point, they were considered a grown-up. They were considered a man. They were full heirs at that point with all the rights and the responsibilities that went along with that. But before that time, they didn't have access to all that stuff. They were still a boy. They were still a child. And what Paul says is that they are equivalent to the other slaves, that they don't have any rights. They don't have any freedoms. They're the same as one of the servants in the household, that they are still technically under the guardians and the managers of the household. Notice what he says next in verse 3. He says this, "In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world." And so what Paul is saying here is, in the same way, you and I are slaves. Only the difference is that we're not slaves to managers and to guardians, that we are slaves to what he calls the elementary principles of the world. Now, this idea of elementary principles, this is just the way that they thought the world worked in the ancient world. And what it's talking about here is this idea of cause and effect, what we would call karma, right? You get what you deserve. This goes back to our scales, doesn't it? That if I just do good enough, if I do enough good works, then God has to let me into heaven. If my bad just kind of barely outweighs my good, then I go to the other place. And so what Paul is saying here is in the same way we were slaves to that way of thinking. But notice what happens next. Verse 4. But when the fullness of time had come. I love this phrase, by the way. The fullness of time. This phrase means when the time was just right. How many of you were here a couple weeks ago when Jared was teaching? And he was teaching, and one of the things that he talked about was cookies. And Jared, I got to be honest, I have not been able to stop thinking about cookies ever since. It is ridiculous. I think part of it is because Megan and Eden have been like researching desserts like crazy, and so I've got this crazy sweet tooth right now. But I have not been able to stop thinking about cookies. But one of the things, if you've ever made cookies, one of the things that you know is that there's this perfect time, isn't there? When those cookies are in the oven and they're ready. And you know at that perfect time you've got to pull them out, right? What happens if you pull the cookies out too early? They're kind of doughy and gross and they're not cooked all the way. I mean, some of you guys like that. We'll pray for you. If you leave them in too long, what happens? Well, they're delicious. We'll pray for you too. They're crisp and they're even burnt. If you leave them in too long, they're burnt and even black. They're not very good. There's like this perfect time, isn't there? That's the picture here. When the time was right, when humanity was ready, it says this, that God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those of us who are under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent his Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father, so that you are no longer a slave. It says you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. What Paul is saying here is that the way that the world works is through you get what you deserve, but that's not the way it works in God's kingdom. The good news of God's kingdom is that you get what you don't deserve. That the economy of God's kingdom is that he works in grace. That's the picture we're seeing here. We're seeing the picture of a servant or a slave who is not just set free by his master, which would be grace, wouldn't it? If a slave is set free from his master, that's a picture of grace. But notice in the story here, God one-ups it. He says, you're not just set free, that you are part of a family, that you are co-heirs, which means you get the same share of the inheritance. That God's kingdom is different from the kingdom of the world because we operate from a place and a position of grace. He goes on then and talks about how we were slaves. Check this out. Verse 8. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. What's that talking about? That's idolatry, right? Those that by nature are not God's. That's idols. An idol, by the way, is anything other than God that we put our faith in. And for the Galatians, this was a very real thing because remember, they were Greek, which means they worshiped in the way that the Greeks worshiped. They had totems that they would worship. They had these different gods that they would worship. And so for them, this idea of idolatry was something that they connected with, something that they related with. But notice what he does next. Verse 9, he says, but now that you have come to know God, or rather be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world whose slaves you want to become once more? Once you've experienced the grace of God, why would you ever go back? Once you've experienced the freedom that comes with following Jesus, why in the world would you ever go back to the scales where you're constantly trying to outweigh the good from the bad? To which I think the Galatians were thinking to themselves, wait, what do you mean we're going back? What do you mean we're turning back to idolatry? Because we're practicing all of these Jewish things. If anything, we're becoming more religious. We're being more spiritual, right? If anything, we're being a better follower of God. That's not idolatry. Watch this. Paul says this in verse 10. You observe what? Days and months and seasons and years. What's that talking about? That's the festivals, isn't it? That if you look at the Jewish calendar, you see that there are festivals for all kinds of different things. You have festivals for days. For example, we've been talking about Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. You would have festivals that would go on for weeks, like Shavuot, or the Feast of Booths. It's also known as the Feast of Weeks. There are some that where they would celebrate different seasons. And then they would even have years that they would celebrate, like the year of Jubilee or a Sabbath year. And so what he's saying here is the problem is that you've gone back to these feasts. Now notice the problem itself isn't necessarily in the feast. It has to do with the way that they observe it. This word observe here in the Greek is very, very specific. Literally what this word means is that they are paying attention to the most minuscule detail of these festivals. That they are observing every little aspect, every little point, every little thing that there is to observe. Are you tracking with me? Okay, the picture here isn't just that they're observing it the way that we might observe Valentine's Day, right? For some of us, Valentine's Day comes along, and what do? Well, we might take our loved one out on a date and go see a movie, and let's be honest, you're going to pay way more than you meant to pay because everything's more expensive on Valentine's Day. This is why some of us say, you know what, we're going to do it some other time, right? When we observe it, we just kind of do it, we practice it, but we're not focusing on the details and the history of St. Valentine's Day, are we? Like, we don't care. But for them, the picture here is that they are observing it so closely, so much to the details, that they're actually putting their faith in these things, that they have begun to view the festivals as the mechanism of salvation. And so what Paul is saying here, don't miss this, is that these festivals, these religious things, they've actually become idols in themselves. Isn't that interesting how we do that? How easy it is for us to take religious things and turn them into idols? I mean, come on, it's easy for us to say that coming here on Sunday morning and being a part of a church is what saves us. Now, don't get me wrong. Being part of a church is good. Being part of a church is absolutely necessary when it comes to taking your next steps in following Jesus. Absolutely. But being a part of a church does not save you. Only Jesus does that. It is so easy for us to fall into the exact same trap that these things, if we're not careful, become idols. It becomes the thing other than God that we begin to worship in our life. And so what Paul is saying here is that you Galatians, you've turned these festivals into idols in your life. Then he says this to really, really, really bring down that point. Verse 11. He says, I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain. He's essentially saying here, look, I'm afraid I've wasted my time with you. Can you imagine? This is their mentor. This is somebody that they look up to, somebody that they respect. Can you imagine hearing those words from somebody that you put a lot of respect in? Like Paul is really, really, really bringing the point down. Verse 12, he says this. This is kind of a weird phrase, by the way. He says, brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. By the way, I've been practicing that all week. I'm impressed I got through that. Become as I am, for I also have become as you are. That's a weird phrase, isn't it? What in the world is that all about? Check this out. That phrase is an idiom that talks about unity. He's saying, look, we need to come together. We need to get together and work this out. Then he goes on to say this, you did me no wrong. I'm not offended by you. You see, whenever we've hurt somebody's feelings and we know it, have you ever noticed that our tendency is to pull away? Because we don't want that awkward moment where we have to apologize and we look at them and we feel guilty for the things that we've done. And so it's easier to just kind of keep our distance. And so what Paul is saying here is, look, guys, we need to come together. We need to work this out. And don't you dare pull away. Don't you pull away, because I know that's the temptation in your life. He says, don't pull away. We need to work this out. We need to come together. Verse 13, he says, you know it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first. So apparently, the whole reason that Paul went to Galatia was because he was sick. There was something wrong with him. Now, we don't know for sure what in the world was wrong with Paul or what exactly he had. But most scholars think that Paul had at some point contracted malaria, probably while he was in Perga, and we see that in Acts chapter 13. Now, in order to recover, Paul would have had to go to a drier climate that we see in Galatia. And so kind of the working theory, the working assumption here, and again, this is not 100% like etched in stone, this is what it is. This is just kind of the general scholarly consensus, is that Paul went to Galatia in order to recover, and while he was there, notice this, he ends up preaching the gospel and actually planting a church while he's there, which is insane, isn't it? Because if you were in Paul's shoes, how many of you would have actually taken that opportunity to do something? If you were in the hospital, how many of you would say, hey, what can I do while I'm here? How can I help out? I don't know about you, but if I'm in the hospital, that's me time, isn't it? Like when I'm in the hospital, I'm focusing on me, myself, and I want some more juice and I want some real food. When we are recovering, when we are going through the difficult times and the difficult seasons of life, our natural tendency is to get very introverted and focus on ourselves. But for Paul, he saw things differently. Paul saw the limitations in his life as an opportunity to do what God wanted him to do. He actually saw the restrictions that God had given him as God leading him exactly where he wanted him to go. And in fact, in a couple of weeks, we're going to start a series on the life of Samson where we're going to talk about how we began to step into our calling, how we began to live the life that God's calling us to live. And one of the things we're going to talk about is how God uses our restrictions and our limitations to bring us where he wants to bring us. Paul here sees his limitation and his sickness not as a reason to check out, not as a reason to abdicate himself from responsibility. He saw it as an opportunity that God was leading him somewhere. Verse 14. And though my condition was a trial to you, meaning I was a pain, you did not scorn me or despise me, but rather received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. What then has become of that blessedness? For I testify that if possible, you would have gouged out your own eyes and given them to me. We've talked about how Paul was going blind. And so what he's saying here is the Galatians, they loved him so much that he's saying if it was possible, if we had had the technology at the time, you would have pulled out your own eyes and given them to me. That's how much you loved me. And he says, what happened? What happened to that kind of blessing? What happened to that kind of love? Then he really brings it down by saying this, verse 16, have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth? Talking about the Judaizers, verse 17, they make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out, that they make much of themselves. See, the Judaizers, they're like that guy or that girl who starts dating that other person, not because they actually like them, but because they see that person as an opportunity to bring them somewhere else, that they're using them, right? And you're looking at them, and you're looking at the Judaizers and the way that they're treating the Galatians, and it's almost like Paul wants to say, oh, honey, no, he doesn't love you, right? She doesn't love you. They're using you. That's what Paul is saying here. Verse 18, it is always good to be made much of for a good purpose. That's kind of a weird way of saying, look, be passionate, but be passionate about the right things. And then he says this, not only when I am present with you. Look, Be a follower of God. Be passionate after God. That's a good thing. Oh, and by the way, don't just do it when I'm around. Like, be that way all the time. Verse 19, notice this. My little children. That's a term of endearment, right? My little children, which, by the way, it's kind of a far cry from where we began in Galatians 3. Do you remember that? Galatians 3 begins by saying, you foolish Galatians. Translation, you idiots. What's wrong with you? And now he's saying, oh, my children. Oh, my little children. Verse 19 continues. He says, my little children, for whom I am again in anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. I wish I could be present with you now and change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. You see, when I first started this letter, I was pretty angry. But as I've been verbalizing this and kind of working this through, now I'm just confused. Now I'm just like curious, like what your mind is, where your head is at. And he says this going on, verse 21. This is why he's confused. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? Like you claim to know the law. You claim to follow the law. But it's like you don't even know it. It's like, have you ever read it before? Verse 22. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and the other by a free woman. Now, what Paul is doing here and what Paul is going to do throughout the rest of this chapter is he's going to reference this story from Genesis 16 to about Genesis 21. Now, if you weren't with us last week, we spent some time looking at Genesis 15, which is the promise and the covenant that God made with Abraham. God goes to Abraham and makes him a promise. He says, you're going to be the father of a great nation. Your offspring are going to outnumber the stars in the sky. I will be your God. You will be my people. You will be this treasured possession. That sounds like a good thing to me. How about you? And what's interesting is the way that Abraham responds to the promise. He essentially says to God, really, I'm going to be the father of a great nation because right now I'm old, I'm elderly. And if I were to die right now, my inheritance would actually go to my servant and his family. Tell me, God, is that what you mean when you say I'm going to be the father of a great nation? And so to give Abraham the assurance of the promise, God forms a covenant with Abraham. And the problem is that just because he formed the covenant didn't mean that it was fulfilled right away. And in fact, years go by, maybe as much as 10 years go by, and there's still no baby. And so Abraham and Sarah get tired of waiting on God, and they decide to do things their way. And so they decide to have a child through one of their servants, a woman named Hagar, which, can we be honest? That's a weird thing to do, isn't it? Like, we're looking at this thousands of years later, and we're like, what's wrong with you? I've seen this on Springer. This is a terrible idea. We know where this is going, don't we? We're not surprised when we read the rest of the story and we see how bad things get because of this decision. That for us, this is a train wreck waiting to happen. And the question that we need to ask is, why do they do this? Why do they choose to have a child through their servant? And to help us out here, what we need to understand is that while it's weird for us, remember, they're living in an ancient world where their way of doing things was very, very, very different. Did you know that in the ancient world, what they're doing here by having a child through their servant, it was actually the expected response to when they couldn't have a child on their own? That this was the cultural expectation. And the reason why this was such a thing in the ancient world is because in the ancient world, the two most important things in your life were your land and your family. Your land was important because it was your provision, right? Like, I plant things, it grows. If I don't have a place to plant things, I'm in trouble. Hopefully I have a source of water. Hopefully my land will provide a place where I can sleep at night and build a house and those sort of things. Like, it's your provision. Now, your family, Your family is your protection. If you have a big enough family, nobody's going to mess with you. Remember, this is more of a barbaric world. Nobody's going to mess with you if your family is big enough. What's better is the more family you have, the more kids you have, the more workers. That's less work I have to do. That sounds good. How about you? But think about this. What happens as you get older? Have you ever noticed that the older you get, the less you can do? Have we reached that stage yet? Anybody? I'm starting to get there, and it's driving me crazy. I hate it. For example, I've reached a stage in my life where I can't do roller coasters anymore. I get on a roller coaster, and I ride one, and I'm like motion sick, and I'm like out of it for the whole day. And what's so sad about this is my kids are finally at the age where they can do roller coasters. Like, this isn't fair. Like, I wanted to do that with them. Now I can't do that with them because I get nauseous every time. I can't do that anymore. And what's worse is the older you get, the worse that it gets, doesn't it? The older you get, the less you can do. And at some point, when it comes to your job and providing for yourself, remember, they're in an agricultural world where you have to tend to the fields on your own. At some point, you can't do that anymore. So what do? I mean, this is a world before retirement, right? This is a world before Social Security. How do you provide for yourself when you can't do it anymore? It's your kids. When you took care of them when they were little, they were going to take care of you when you couldn't take care of yourself. Your family was essential, and I can't emphasize this enough. It was essential for survival in the ancient world. And so in the ancient world, if you were barren and you couldn't have kids, the cultural expectation was after a year or so. Yeah, that soon. After a year or so, you would marry your servant, and you would have a child through them so that you could start building the family. And so that's exactly what Abraham does. And he has a child through Hagar, and his name is Ishmael. We're going to call him Ishi. And so we've got Hagar and Ishi. And that would have been fine, but the problem is as the story goes on, we see that Sarah has a child, and his name is Isaac. And all of a sudden, you've got these two children, don't you? And that, we know that creates all kinds of tension later. But notice what Paul does, verse 23. But the son of the slave, speaking of Hagar and Ishi, was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born according to the promise. Now, this may be interpreted allegorically, that these two women are two covenants. And so, okay, these two women, they're like two covenants, Paul says. One of them, one is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery, and she is Hagar. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and she corresponds with the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother, for it is written, Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor, for the children of the desolate one will become more than those who had a husband. Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. What he's saying here is that the son of Hagar in this example, it's like the Judaizers, that they're putting their faith in the law. But the message that I'm telling you, when you put your faith in Jesus, you step into the promise, the same promise that God gave Abraham all those years ago. And then he says this, we're going to finish the chapter, and then I promise we're going to try to make some sense of what this whole thing is all about. Verse 29, he wraps it up by saying this, but just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also is it now. This is talking about Genesis 21. When Ishi is at the weaning celebration of Isaac, they would actually celebrate the time when the child was weaned. And the reason why they did this was because they're living in a culture of high infant mortality. And so it was a big celebration when the child was old enough. By the way, ladies, be grateful. Did you know that in the ancient world, the age of weaning was about 5 years old? Yeah, I usually get that response whenever I say that. And so they were at this celebration, and the problem is that Ishmael started making fun of Isaac. He started making fun of him. He was persecuting him. And what Paul is saying here is that that's exactly what the Judaizers are doing to me and to us. He goes on to say this, verse 30, but what does it say in the scriptures? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, We are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. Now, as we try to make some sense of this, we need to kind of begin by wrestling the question, like, what is the deal with the children here? And if I'm honest, by the way, it almost feels backwards, doesn't it? Like, in my mind, the Judaizers should be connected with Sarah, not Hagar, because they're both Jewish. And the Gentiles, the Galatians, would almost fit better with Hagar, but that's not what we have here. And the reason why it's not, and the reason why Paul is making this whole analogy is because we don't understand the tension that they're feeling in the ancient world when they're reading this story, because now they have two children, right? They don't just have two children. Understand, they have two firstborn children. And in the ancient world, the idea of being labeled the firstborn or having the right of the firstborn was a huge deal. It was massive. One of the reasons why it was so important to have the label of being the firstborn was because you would get the lion's share of the inheritance, somewhere around 75-80% of it, which is a lot. The other reason why it's so important is the firstborn would also then be the next patriarch for the family. They were the ones who were in charge of making the decisions. And so this idea of being labeled the firstborn was a very big deal. But the problem here is we have two firstborn. Hagar's first and Sarah's first. We don't look at it like that, do we? But that's the way that they would have seen it. By the way, as you go through the book of Genesis, this tension of the firstborn comes up over and over again. For example, Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau, and their whole story is them fighting over the birthright. You go on a little further, you see that Jacob has a son named Joseph, but he also has three other firstborns outside of Joseph. We know Joseph, why? The coat of what? Many colors. What's the point of the coat? What's the significance of that? Did you know that the coat was actually a robe? And in the ancient world, a robe was a symbol of power and authority. When Joseph receives the coat of many colors, he's receiving the birthright. He's receiving the right of the firstborn. That's why that point is a catalyst that makes all the brothers turn on him. This was a very, very, very big deal, and it caused a whole lot of issues in the family structure. And so the question that we're meant to ask as we're finishing this chapter is, which child should get the right of the firstborn? Well, technically speaking, what we want to say, by the way, is, well, of course it's Isaac, because we know the end of the story, and he's obviously the one who receives the promise. But if we're looking at it chronologically, who should get the right of the firstborn? It's Ishi, right? He was chronologically first. He's the firstborn. Like, literally, that's what it means. And what Paul is saying here is this is why the sons of slavery, the Judaizers, are connected to Hagar. Because if you were to keep it legalistically, then this is where it would lead you. But that's not the way it works in God's kingdom, that God is going to fulfill it through the promise. And the promise is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. And that's the good news. You see, the good news, again, is we don't have to worry about those elementary principles anymore. The good news is that we are saved by the grace of God through faith. And when we choose to follow Jesus, when we choose to give our life to him, he begins to come inside and begin to work in us. He begins to shape and form us into the person that he's calling us to be. By the way, next week, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how God begins to do that work, that transformation in our life, and what that looks like. Let me pray for us. God, thank you so much for today. God, thank you for Paul and these words. God, we thank you for the grace, the mercy, and the forgiveness of Jesus. That we don't have to spend our life anxious about whether or not we've done enough to make you happy. But we can have confidence, knowing that we can have a relationship with you, knowing that we are saved by your grace through faith and faith alone in Jesus. God, I pray that you would open our eyes and show us the idols in our life, the things other than you that we like the Galatians, want to put our faith in. Maybe for us, it's religious stuff like coming to church. Maybe for us, it's our jobs. It's our friends or people in our life. Maybe it's money. That if we just had this thing, then everything will be good. God, I pray that you would show us the idols in our life. And give us the courage to set those aside as we put our faith in you, where it truly belongs. For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.